now develops another piece, a knight towards the center. And then white gets out his bishop. And let's say black counterattacks here and plays knight to e5, hitting the bishop. Let's say white continues bishop to b3, and now black gives a check. Bishop to b4 check. Normally, you shouldn't just give a check if it results in a loss of time. But here black has a trick in mind. He wants to lure white into playing c3, which weakens this square. Now it's no longer guarded by a pawn. So he plays bishop c5, attacking the queen. Now notice the queen could take that bishop, but if it does so, this square no longer guarded, the black knight moves in here and gives a knight fork, winning the queen. So, in this situation, white can't take the bishop. He would lose his queen. Let's say you play to this square, hitting the knight and hitting the pawn, giving a fork of your own. However, I'm afraid there's a rude surprise here at the end. Bishop takes f2 check. A bishop fork does in white, because how are you going to respond here? If you take it off with the queen, you get forked on this square by a knight. That we knew to be weak. And if you take it back with the king, then you get forked on this square with the other knight. So watch out for forks against your own position, and early on look for double attacks right from the start. Our next tactic is the pin. You create a pin when one of your units attacks two or more enemy units along the same line, along the same diagonal, rank, or file. Here, the white bishop could move to a4, pinning the black knight to the king. The knight cannot move because it would expose the king to attack. This, therefore, is an absolute pin. This knight can move under no circumstances, and therefore the knight is lost. We would say the bishop pins the knight to the king. In our next situation, the bishop can pin the knight, but the black king can defend it. It can move up along the diagonal and protect the knight. However, the knight can't move. It's still pinned down. Its hands are tied. And what should you do to a pinned piece? Attack it again, preferably with something of very little value, like a pawn. And here, by moving the pawn up, the knight is helpless. It can't move away. Next turn, white will capture it for nothing. So try to pin your opponent's pieces and then pile up on them. For example here, let's say white plays e4, black responds e5, knight to f3, d6, Philidor's defense, bishop to c4, and now bishop to g4, creating a pin on the knight to the white queen. This is a relative pin, not an absolute one, because if white chooses, perhaps at some useful point, he can move the knight and accept the consequences of losing his queen, although at this time it's not desirable. Let's say white continues knight to c3, and black responds h6, a very poor move. Obviously done to prevent the knight from going to the square. There's no chance of that. Knight takes e5, giving up the white queen. The knight was pinned, but not absolutely. Black takes the queen, and white then can give checkmate. Bishop takes f7 check, king to e7, and now the third minor piece comes up, the second knight, knight to d5, and it's mate. It's beautiful the way the three pieces coordinate to give the checkmate here. The pin wasn't a meaningful one. It could be broken. So in your own games, to summarize, try to create pins. Once you've pinned an enemy piece, don't necessarily capture it. Maybe it's better to pile up on it, especially with pawns and other low-value items. And if you have established a pin, make sure it's not an illusory one, a relative pin that can be broken at an unpleasant point. Our next tactic is the skewer. We just looked at the pin where two pieces were attacked along the same line, and the front one was less valuable. In a skewer, it's just the opposite. It's the back one that's less valuable. Here, for example, we see the bishop checking the black king. It has to move out of check, and that exposes the knight behind to capture. See how the bishop runs through the king to attack the knight in shish kebab fashion. Sometimes you can give a skewer and the pieces that are attacked are of the same value. Here we have two knights. They're skewered. Here's a little problem that shows sometimes you can set up your skewers. They're not just in the position. For example, here it's black to play. Black can check the white king. And notice there's the queen behind it. This is a skewer, but the king can take the bishop. However, what's happened is that the king has been drawn further up the board so that now black can follow with another skewer, shifting across the board, attacking the king and the queen behind it. The king moves, and the queen can be captured. So look for skewers, try to set them up, and perhaps you have to play one tactic to follow up with another. Our next tactic is the discovery or discovered attack. In a discovered attack, you have two friendly units along the same line. One moves, the front one, and it unveils an attack from the back one. Here, for example, we have a bishop and rook lined up on the e-file. The bishop can move, and by doing so, it uncovers an attack from the rook. The rook gives check to the enemy king. That check must be responded to, which means that the moving unit, in this case the bishop, gets away with a free attack against the black queen. And black can't respond to that threat because he first must save his king. And that's what's strong about the discovered attack possibility. The moving unit has carte blanche to do just about anything you want it to. In this example, the bishop can move, giving check itself, so that both the moving unit and the stationary one give check. That's a double check, and in this case it's mate. You could try to block the check from the rook, but the king is still in check from the bishop. And if you try to block the bishop's check, well, we still have a rook check. Here's a game which illustrates the tactic unfolding in a few moves. E4, E5, F4, the king's gambit. Black takes the pawn. White plays knight to F3, preventing the black queen from checking at this point, which would hit the king along this exposed diagonal. Black gives a pawn back for development's sake, D5. Instead of taking it, white plays knight to C3. Black takes the pawn. White takes it back. And now black develops his queen's bishop, a little prematurely, pinning this knight, by the way, but it's a relative pin. White plays queen to E2. Not a typical move because it slightly blocks in this bishop, but setting up a surprise tactic. Black took the knight. Bishop takes F3, thinking white had to take it back because the queen's attacked. But he didn't. Instead, he played knight to F6, double check, and mate. Notice that, true, the queen could be captured, but then black would still be in check from the knight. And true, there are many ways to take the knight, but there would still be a check from the queen. So even though both attacking pieces could be captured ordinarily, here they can't, either one can't be captured because they're both giving check. So look to set up discoveries, and especially try to set up double checks. Our next tactic is undermining, or removing the guard, or removing the defender. Let's take a look at a concrete example and illustrate what I'm getting at. Here, the white knight attacks the bishop. The bishop is protected. In undermining, we can capture the piece that protects this bishop. We can take the knight. So here, by playing bishop takes c6, and if black takes it back, white can get the bishop for free. Knight takes e5. We have undermined its protection. You can also, in some cases, instead of capturing the protector, drive it away by attacking it. Here, for example, we have a similar position. The knight again attacks the black bishop. Black's knight defends it. We can't capture the black knight, but we can drive it away by b5. Once the knight moves, it leaves the bishop vulnerable to capture. So in undermining, you can capture the protector or drive it away. Now, one concept that comes out time and again in undermining is the idea of the overworked piece, where one defender is trying to do too much and can't handle all the threats coming at it. Let's consider this in the context of a game. White begins d4, black responds f5, the Dutch defense. White plays this unusual move, bishop to g5, and black, thinking it's so wild and unexpected, attacked it, h6. The bishop retreated, g5, really moving the pawns dangerously on the king side, bishop to g3, but he has in mind the goal of trapping the bishop, f4. Very nice, except look at this weakened diagonal. And white aims right for it. Now he plays e3, threatening mate at h5, and giving his bishop the chance to escape by capturing the f4 pawn. Black saw through that and played h5, so that now we cannot take the pawn and give mate because the rook protects it. Meanwhile, black is threatening to trap the bishop. No problem. White played bishop to d3 with this exquisite mate possibility, bishop to g6, a diagonal bishop mate. Black's rook saw through that, rook to h6. But we have a problem here in that that rook is guarding against two different mates, the one at h5 by the queen and the one from the bishop at d3 going to g6. The rook is overloaded. It's doing too much. If we respond with one of those threats, the rook will have to answer. It will then be out of position, unable to answer the second threat. And that's what happened. White played queen takes h5 check. Black took it back. And this fantastic mate at the end here, bishop to g6, a diagonal mate. What could black expect? He moved none of his central pawns. He's undeveloped. He moved all the pawns that exposed his king on the king side. Look to undermine your opponent's pieces. Try to capture pieces that defend other units. Try to drive them away. And try to exploit overworked enemy pieces. One final concept, tactically, is that of the battery, where two friendly pieces attack along the same diagonal, rank, or file in conjunction. For example, a queen and bishop can work together along the diagonal, a queen and rook along ranks and files, or two rooks along ranks and files. I'd like to show you a game which nicely illustrates a diagonal battery. It was played by Paul Morphy, a great American player from the 19th century, and it was played at an opera against two opponents working together against him. e4, e5, knight f3, d6, d4, exerting more pressure against the black center. Black pinned white's knight, bishop to g4. White took on e5. Black interpolated, bishop takes f3. White took it back with his queen. Here, a natural development of the queen. D takes e5. And now white played bishop to c4, which registered an attack together with the queen against f7, threatening mate. Black had to stop that and shielded that point by playing knight to f6. At this time, white gave a very nice double attack. He played queen to b3. On the one hand, the queen attacks the b7 pawn, but it also, together with the bishop, gives an attack to f7. This is a battery. In fact, we can say that the queen attacks f7 through the bishop because it really backs up the bishop's invasion. And this is exactly what a battery is, a diagonal one. White went on to win this game very nicely. Now, we can also have, as I said earlier, a rook battery. Here's such an example. We have two rooks on the 7th rank working together, attacking g7. This rook, the back rook, attacks through this rook and supports its invasion or its capture of the g7 pawn. Here, white has a forced checkmate. He can play rook takes g7 check. Black would have to move to the corner because the rook is protected. We could take the second pawn. Rook takes h7 check. The king would have to move out of check. And now the back rook, which has really done a lot of damage without having moved yet, does move and goes to g7. And that's a mate on the 7th rank. So look for batteries and try to avoid them if they're coming at you. I'd like to show you one final game which brings everything together. It was played in 1895 between Steinitz and von Bartholeben at Hastings. It started e4, e5, a double king pawn opening, knight f3, knight c6, bishop to c4, focusing on this weak point, bishop c5, and we have the Joko piano, or quiet or slow game. White continued c3, preparing to advance the d-pawn, establishing a classical pawn center. Black counterattacked, knight to f6. White continued with his plan, d4. An exchange took place on d4, assailing the bishop at c5. It got out of attack and gained some time by giving a check. Bishop to b4 check. White interposed the knight, knight to c3. And here we come to a point where black has a number of moves. He could play knight takes e4, a rather tactical line, or he could play d5 as in the actual game. E takes d5, knight takes d5. And here with the opening of the e-file, white castled, getting his king out of the center and enabling his rook at f1 to capitalize on this open line. Black could, at this point, take the knight, but it's highly dangerous. Knight takes c3, b takes c3, and if you continue bishop takes c3, you run smack into queen to b3, a double attack, hitting the bishop and creating a battery on this diagonal, hitting at f7. If you take the rook at a1, we have this explosive possibility. Bishop takes f7 check. You have to really be quite cautious here. If you play king to e7, goodbye queen, a skewer winning it, bishop g5 check. If you play instead king to d7, that's all there is in this game, queen to e6 mate. So you'd have to play king to f8, and after bishop to a3 check, and after blocking at e7, white would take the rook and would retain the possibility of playing rook to e1, piling up on the pinned knight, and it would be terminal. So rather than that, black didn't continue in that way. And let's get back to our real game over here. That is, he didn't capture on c3. Instead, he played bishop to e6, protecting his knight. White continued his attack with bishop to g5. And now the the black queen is under fire. Black interceded with the bishop, bishop to e7. White traded a few pieces here, trying to exploit one extra move in development, or in time. Bishop takes on d5, bishop takes on d5. White exchanged, knight takes d5. The queen took it back. And after one more set of exchanges on e7, we see that the looming attack here becomes an actuality, rook to e1, pinning the knight at e7. And what is black to do? He can't castle. His king is now stuck in the center of the board. And we have a pin on that knight. If you castle either way, the knight goes. Black is also a little bit afraid of perhaps rook to e5 or the invasion of the white knight to e5 or g5. So he played f6. The drawback here is that that's a weakening pawn move. It weakens this square. Of course, there's another reason that black does this. He's hoping that maybe he can sneak out with his king to f7 and extricate his rook from the corner and castle by hand. Let's see what happens. White played queen to e2, doubling on the e-file, threatening checkmate with a battery, a queen and rook battery. Black had to bring his queen back to guard that point. And now white played rook to c1, mobilizing his last piece. All of his pieces are on good squares. And if you had to determine the spatial edge here, white has an enormous advantage. I think it's something like 3 or 4 to 1 in total squares guarded across the frontier line. Black hardly has any control of the white side of the board on the other side of the frontier line. Here black continued c6 so that his queen wouldn't be tied down to defending the c-pawn, and perhaps also to stop the advanced d5. But it didn't work. White continued anyway d5, because afterwards he gets this square for his knight, and his spatial edge is even greater because from the d4 launching pad, The knight has the possibility of going to f5, piling up on e7, or invading to e6, or even coming into b5. Black played king f7 here to somewhat guard this point, but white intruded anyway, knight to e6, which supports the possibility of rook to c7. Black had to stop that. Rook to c8. And at this time, white transferred his queen to the king side, queen to g4, with the ominous threat of capturing on g7. In fact, if given the opportunity, white will play queen takes g7 check, and back here, and we'd have checkmate. Not a very savory thing to look forward to. So let's go back. So to stop that, black had to play another weakening pawn move. He played g6. And that allowed white to unveil an attack to black's queen with knight to g5 check, discovery. Not many options here. You have to protect your queen. And black did do that. King to e8. And Steinitz found a brilliant coup. He sacrificed his rook. Rook takes e7 check. And what is black to do? We see at first that you can't play queen takes e7, because if you did that, white would play rook takes c8 check. And that's quite serious, because after the set of exchanges that takes place, white is going to remain at least a knight ahead. So you can't do that. Meanwhile, if you play king takes e7, many terrible things can happen to black. For example, rook to e1 check, getting the white rook out of attack. The king cannot move to the f file because that drops the queen. You'd have to go king to d8 or king to d6. If you played king to d8, we'd have knight check on e6, which also guards the other potential escape square here. You'd have to move back into line on the e file, and then look what happens. Knight to c5, discovered check from the rook, a free attack to the queen. We're going to win the queen. So that would leave really back in this position, not retreating to d8, but moving up to d6. And then you encounter the bristling queen to b4 check. If you play rook to c5, rook e6 ends all resistance. You're going to drop a lot of material. And if you simply retreat king to c7, there follows knight to e6 check, guarding the king, and another escape square. You'd have to retreat here, and then queen to f4 check. What are you going to block the check with? Rook to c7. We take the rook, and if you play out this tragedy, and black takes it c7, we get rook e8 mate, because the queen is pinned. And so we can't throw it away to block the check. This didn't happen. Let's get back to the real game. At this point, white's giving check to the king, and we see that black cannot take with the queen or the king. We've just analyzed all those possibilities. So he played king to f8. I want you to note here that really all the white pieces are under attack and can be captured. This can be captured by the black rook. White's queen can be captured if black gets the chance. This rook can be captured, and even this knight. So everything is kind of hanging out there. White continued rook to f7 check. Black cannot come back to the center because this would be checkmate. Look at that power on the 7th rank. But black didn't walk into this debacle. Instead, he played king to g8, and white played rook to g7 check. You can't play king takes rook because, queen goes. And we see you can't play queen takes because there's this X-ray support, the skewer-like attack against c8, and the white rook could capture again. So you have to move the king. Where to? Back this way or to the corner? If you go this way, knight takes h7 check. Either wins the queen or gives checkmate. It's that simple, because if you take the rook, we get the queen with check. And if you come back here, I think we've seen this before in a way. Queen takes d7 mate. So that can't be played. which means the king from this position, instead of coming back to the center, has to move to the corner. And again, rook h7 check. Same set of analysis. We can't take the rook without losing this one. King to g8. And after rook to g7 check, black walked out of the room and didn't show up for the remainder of the game. White demonstrated that there would be a mate, and that's why he walked out. If queen takes, we have rook takes c8 check. And if king takes, queen takes check. If you go back to the corner, we have queen h4 check, and finally black would have to take that rook. King takes, and this is how the game would have concluded. Queen h7 check, king f8, queen h8 check. The king would have to come here to the center. The queen would move a little closer. Queen g7 check. You can't come up to d6 because this would lead to checkmate once again. So black wouldn't do this, but he still can't escape checkmate. No way to do that. So after this check, if you go here, we'd play queen check, king up, queen check, king back, queen check. Queen would have to block. Then this knight check, the king would come up, and we'd have a mate. Queen to d6 mate. Just a glorious, brilliant game. So much came out from this enterprise here. White exploited his time advantage, his spatial advantage. All the things we looked at, pins, forks, skewers, they all materialized in this game. Go out and be brilliant.